Good day students, I'm Ms. Iol Cc Bes Eng41, your tutor for learner support in English for BS. Welcome to this contact-based session for 2019. Let's first look at an introduction of what this module is about. It's studied in Year 4, Semester 1, and it aims to teach you to analyze learning support of issues regarding the teaching, learning of grammar, speaking, reading, writing, prose, poetry, and assessment. So it's quite a challenging module. The school subject content is the vehicle for education because through such content, learners start to understand the world they live in and the system we use, as well as the values and skills. It also will help you to cope with your future work and life. The aims of this module thus are to enable the student to develop the theoretical understanding, values and competencies regarding the support of upper primary learners in English. So let's go full steam ahead with looking at Unit 1, some of the key issues underpinning learning support and syllabus guidelines. The first aspect I'm going to highlight is Bloom's 3 domains of learning. You might be familiar with them already. Let's just quickly run through them. The first is the physical domain, which refers to psychomotor objectives. Traditionally, these types of objectives are concerned with physically encoding information, with movement, and with activities where the gross and fine muscles are used for expressing or interpreting information or concepts. It also refers to natural autonomic responses or reflexes. The second domain is the cognitive one, or also called academic. It involves knowledge and the development of intellectual skills, the recall of recognition of specific facts, procedural patterns and concepts that serve in the development of intellectual abilities and skills. And the third and last domain is the emotional or affective, which includes the manner in which we deal with things emotionally, such as our feelings, values, appreciation, enthusiasm, motivation and attitudes. The next aspect we want to look at is processing information, and we distinguish between shallow and deep processing. Shallow processing consists of structural processing, where you only encode the physical qualities of something. Phonemic processing is where we encode the sound of words. What's important to note is that shallow processing only involves maintenance rehearsal. That means repetition to help us hold something in our short-term memory. So it leads to fairly short-term retention of the information, and it's also the only type of rehearsal to take place within the multi-store model. When we look at deep processing, on the other hand, semantic processing comes to mind, where we need to encode the meaning of a word and relate it to similar words with similar meaning. This involves elaboration rehearsal with a more meaningful analysis of information, and it also leads to better recall. For example, giving words a meaning or linking them with previous knowledge. The next aspect we focus on is what are 6 principles of good practice which teachers and parents can use to reinforce positive emotions and values in learners. The first one is to prompt motivation. Motivation comes from confidence, which is the harvest of competence. You need to break down new challenges for the child or the learner into manageable components, monitor progress, support effort, praise new competencies, and give the learner a chance to showcase them. Secondly, it's good if you can spark a learner's curiosity. Curiosity thrives on opportunities to take chances on ideas and to enjoy the messiness of questions as well as the tidiness of answers. It's important to remember that imagination and humor are very important parts as well of keeping a child motivated. You should thirdly try to nourish the intellect, the talent and the power of the learner. Find out what he or she does well. Budget your time, your money and your psychological energies for the good stuff. There's a saying that says unsupported weaknesses ache, but unexercised talents itch. And I think that's very meaningful in this case. In the fourth place, try to encourage connections. Too much of schooling happens in compartments. This can be counteracted by helping learners to connect their experiences with words, the words with pictures, the pictures with music, and then by weaving ideas and happenings into a web of life. Of course, this will make things so much more meaningful for our students when they learn. In the fifth place, you should monitor growth. You can, for example, assemble a portfolio for each learner and ask them to keep a journal. You can even record their height, everyone's height on the side of a door frame. Maybe another suggestion is on Fridays to ask learners one thing they did this week for the first time. And of course, very importantly, be a model. Do the same things for yourself as well. In the sixth place, teach them to accept special considerations and also accept special considerations yourself. We must provide for learners' weaknesses. We must remember that laughter is good for the soul, and then organizational help and opportunities for the development of talent and the reinforcement of character should always be made. This brings us to Unit 2. Unit 2 deals with the elements of learning support for the upper primary curriculum of English. And the first point I'm going to pay attention to is the roles in communicative language teaching. According to Breen and Candlin, the teacher has two main roles. His first role is to facilitate the communication process between the participants and the classroom, but also between these participants and the various activities and texts. Secondly, the teacher acts as an independent participant within the learning teaching group, and this is closely related to the objectives of the first role and what arises from it. Because of these roles, it also implies that the teacher has a set of secondary roles. Firstly, the teacher is an organizer of resources and he's a resource himself. Secondly, he's a guide within the classroom procedure and activities. A third role is that of the researcher and learner, contributes in terms of appropriate knowledge and abilities, actual and observed experience of the nature of learning, and the organizational capacities. The focus on fluency and comprehensibility in communicative language teaching may cause anxiety among teachers, accustomed to seeing error suppression and correction as the major instructional responsibility. So this is of importance here because some teachers see their primary function as preparing learners to take standardized or other kinds of tests. And this then also gives them a concern that there might be a deleterious effect in pair or group work of imperfect modeling and learner error. But this is actually, according to research, not the case, as it suggests that data contradicts the notion that other learners are not good conversational partners because they cannot provide accurate input when it is solicited. Communicative language teaching is best considered an approach rather than a method. A reasonable degree of theoretical consistency can be discerned at the levels of language and learning theory. At the levels of design and procedure, there is much greater room for individual interpretation and variation than most methods permit. It could be that one version among the various proposals for syllabus models, exercise types, and classroom activities may gain wider approval in the future, which might give communicative language teacher a status similar to other teaching methods. On the other hand, there's a lot of divergent interpretations which might lead to homogeneous subgroups in this teaching approach. Okay, now I'm going to look at the application of learner-centered features in lessons across the 5 areas. Learner-centered teaching engages learners in the hard, messy work of learning, we said. Now, when you study this part of the module, I want you really to think of it in an analytical way, and if you had to give an opinion on learner-centered education, the pros and the cons, what would you comment? So let's run through these. At this stage, if we look at a teacher-centered type of education, we find that in a lot of cases teachers are doing too much and the learners are doing too little. We offer all the examples, we offer the content, we do a preview and a review. So in most classes, we will find that to this day, teachers are the busy ones, while the students are more passive. So it's not a suggestion that we should never do these tasks, but the learner will never develop a sophisticated way of learning without the chance to practice. And in most classrooms, the teachers get far more practice than the learner. So that's why we must particularly see how can we enforce, how can we promote learner-centered teaching in our classrooms. It encourages learners to reflect on what they are learning and how they are learning. So that is the importance of it. We get, if we want to be learner-centered teachers, we need to talk about learning. In casual conversations, we must ask learners about how and what they are learning. Make the class talk about their own learning. Challenge the learners' assumptions about learning and encourage them to accept responsibility for the decisions they make about their learning. Also talk about how they study for exams, when they do assigned reading, whether they revise their writing and check their answers. We find that learner-centered teachers include assignment components in which learners reflect, analyze and critique what they are learning and how they are learning it. The goal that we have here is to make learners aware of themselves as learners and make learning skills something that learners want to develop. So let's have a look at what the different methods of teaching and learning were in the English classroom. Some of these are traditional and others are modern. So there's a similar table in your guide which I want you to study. I'm not going to go through everything in detail here. Let's just have a look. We've got the grammar translation, which focuses on written literary text, the direct method, which focuses on everyday spoken language, the audiolingual method with sentence and sound patterns, the cognitive code approach, which focuses on grammar rules, the silent way, which focuses on learner interaction rather than teacher interaction, Suggestopedia, which focuses on meaningful text and vocabulary, the community language learning approach, which focuses on learner interaction, the communicative language teaching approach, which focuses on interacting, authentic communication and negotiating meaning, the content-based, task-based and participatory approaches that focuses on what is being communicated and not the structure of English. So of course for each of you, you must be able to name them, you must know their focus and also the features of each. That brings us to Unit 3, which focuses on learning support, specifically when we look at grammar. And here I found it meaningful to look at how can we use role plays in our classroom to support grammar. There are 4 different types of role play. The first is the conflict role play, which puts participants on a collision course and asks them to deal with this as best as they can. It could be something like asking them to change an airline booking at peak time, and it tests their skills under pressure. This specific type of role play is more for a mature and confident type of student, so you wouldn't use it for beginners. Then we get the cooperative role play, which takes the opposite tack and requires participants to work together for the common good. It can, for instance, be brainstorming on ways to attract tourists to local attractions. It involves mostly a safe situation, so it's good for gently easing shy learners into conversation and for building relationship with other learners. Then there's the information gap role play. It's based on filling in holes in the participants' knowledge. For example, answering questions from custom officers. So here it's based on the learner's real self and it's quite simple to set up. But if you want to make the situation fictitious, of course it might require more elaborate preparation. It's a very good way to practice question and answer patterns and also to prepare learners for real-life encounters. Then we get the task-based role play, which requires the participant to complete a set of activities, for example, checking into a hotel or giving directions to a taxi driver. It's useful to help learners to practice realistic survival English skills, and it's also an excellent way to build their confidence in their ability to function in real-life situations. So now particularly, what is the value of these role plays and simulations in grammar lessons? And you can see in brackets there I also added, please consider both negative and positive aspects. So what we know about role plays and simulations is that they're forms of experiential learning. The learners take on different roles, they assume a profile of a character and a personality, and they then interact and participate in different and complex settings. A simulation is often a familiar or a realistic situation in which a participant's role may not be as prominent or distinctive as it would have been in a role play. At this stage, I just want to quickly mention to you, if we talk about a simulation, it means that the student plays himself or herself, but in a certain situation. If it's a role play, the student takes on a different character. He doesn't play himself in a role play, but simulation is a type of role play, if you understand what I mean. Okay, these things also function as learning tools for teams and groups or individuals as they play face to face. It also alters the power ratios in teaching and learning relationship between learners and educators, because the learners are now allowed to learn through their explorations and the viewpoints of the characters or personality they are articulating in the environment. This learner-centered space can enable learner-oriented assessment, where the design of the task is created for active learning. It's very important, or something that's very, very positive here, is that learners are actively involved. They do self and peer assessment, and then they can obtain sustainable formative feedback from one another. SLEs thus provide a safe, supportive environment where learners can develop their clinical skills, their competency and agency. It's also flexible and controllable, and educators find they can design suitable and varied education events within them. In terms of ESL teaching, role plays give learners the opportunity to demonstrate how to use English in real-life situations, and it helps them to focus more on the communication than on the grammar. It can be a great deal of fun, but you must take caution if you have a class full of shy learners, because they might be a bit reluctant to participate. So it's always important to know your learners. Regardless of what type of role play you intend to do, it's imperative that your learners feel comfortable with the necessary structures and vocabulary. Mini role plays can be done in any lesson as a practice activity. You can even do it in the same lesson as the introduction and the drilling of a new topic, if your learners have a good understanding of the new material. As a lesson, this would be ideal after several lessons on the same topic. Okay, then how can we use role plays at the end of the term for projects for intermediate and advanced learners? Note that we cannot really do it as effectively with our beginners, because the learner needs sufficient knowledge to draw upon to enact real-life situations and to get really creative. It would take quite a few lessons if you would make it a project. Maybe one where you introduce it, split the class into groups and let learners brainstorm and then develop their script. Then they need to practice, and then also their final performances. The first submission, for instance, can be to correct grammar, and the second submission should be the final script. This will ensure that the learners can take chances and that they push their abilities, and it prevents them from practicing incorrect material, and it verifies that they are making progress on the project. Something important to note here is that role plays can be immensely time consuming, and that they really require good planning and structure. But once that is done, they are easy to conduct. It might be less stressful than preparing for an exam, and it's also mostly more enjoyable than an exam for both the teacher and the learner. It's often set up to target particular grammar points. For example, if you want to focus on the simple past tense or the future with going to, infinite, or actually any aspect of grammar you want to reinforce. We come to Unit 4. Unit 4 focuses on how we can support listening and speaking in the classroom. There are 4 impediments to listening for emotion. In other words, barriers, and they are stress and out of control emotion, lack of focus, inconsistent body language, and information overload. Let's see what is meant by each of these. If you have a lack of focus, you can't communicate effectively. And that's particularly when you are busy with other things while you're supposed to focus and listen. If you're planning what you're going to say next, daydreaming, or checking your cell phone for text messages, you'll very likely miss non-verbal clues in a conversation. It's important that you stay focused on the moment-to-moment experience in order to really understand what the speaker is saying. The second thing is inconsistent body language. Non-verbal communication should reinforce what is being said. It shouldn't contradict it. In other words, if your body language says something that doesn't stroke with a verbal message, the listener might think that you're dishonest, or you might confuse the listener. For instance, I can't say yes while I'm shaking my head to say no. Then there's also the aspect of negative body language. Sometimes we don't like what the other person is saying, and subconsciously we use negative body language. For example, we cross our arms, or we avoid eye contact, or we tap our feet. So here it's important to remember that even if we don't agree with what is being said, we should be careful that we don't start acting defensive and that we don't send negative signals. In addition, we must try not to be avoided by making a critical evaluation of the speaker. Rather, try to focus on what the speaker is saying, thus concentrate on the message rather than the messenger. Now, there are of course strategies which can help us to understand the emotions of a speaker better. The first thing is to stop, in other words, focus on the person, their thoughts and feelings. Look, pay attention to the messages, the non-verbal ones, and don't get distracted. Listen for the essence of the speaker's thoughts, their details, their ideas, their meanings. Then be empathetic. That means imagine how you would feel in their circumstances. Also ask questions to clarify your understanding and to show that you are interested. Then it is useful to analyze your own perception and also work on improving your perception. Focus on others, then you will understand them better, gather knowledge about them, listen to them actively, and imagine how you would feel in their situation. We go over to a completely different aspect, but it's focused on speaking. So let's have a look at pronunciation in upper primary speaking. We know that English words can sometimes be difficult to pronounce, because we don't just have to consider the pronunciation of an individual word, we have to make a connection between the words in a sentence. Important here is to consider the rhythm and the intonation in the sentence, and for a primary learner it can be very difficult because they still get a bit confused. Two things that you can do to help learners to improve their English pronunciation is to ask them to practice not just in class but also at home and with their friends and parents. Tell them to keep practice listening. So you can see the reason why we're talking about speaking here is because speaking and listening are intertwined. We cannot have the one without the other. The more that learners listen to English, the more their pronunciation will naturally get closer and closer to the native pronunciation. A good way that you can help your children to practice is to give them an audio sample with a transcript. They can listen to one or two sentences while reading it, then pause the audio and try to repeat the sentence in the same way they heard it. They can practice pronunciation like this to improve fast, and then they can also maybe watch YouTube videos, because many of these YouTube videos have subtitles. So by listening and reading the subtitles at the same time can be very, very helpful in improving your accent and your pronunciation in English. We move over now to some common causes of reading problems, symptoms, and the remedial strategies. So when I go through these, I'm going to run through them quite quickly, but you can go and look. There's a similar table, or actually the exact same table in your study guide that you need to take note of and make sure of, that you have the cause, the symptom, the investigation, and the remediation of each very clearly. So of meaning here is visual acuity, where the child may squint. Eye coordination, where the child may complain of losing his place, skipping lines, or using his finger to track words. Scotopic sensitivity syndrome, the child may complain of words getting blurry or running off the page at the end of lines. He may not even realize that there is any other way to see. Then there's difficulty knowing sounds the letters make, especially the vowel sounds. You'll find that the child may guess at words and make errors where vowels are involved. And then also difficulty for the child to break the words into syllables. So he may be able to read small words and seem to look at the first few letters and then guess at longer words. So that then the different problems and what you should be considering. Like I said, don't only look at the causes and the symptoms of reading problems, but also be sure that you can say how you will investigate these to make sure that they are identified correctly, and then also how you will remediate or how you will treat the problem, in other words. Then we move over to our next topic, which is direct and indirect teaching. Here you need to be sure that you know the definition of each, and also, of course, that you can differentiate between these methods. First of all, indirect instruction. It's approach to teaching and learning, in which the process is inquiry, the content involves concepts, and context is a problem. While direct instruction strategies are best suited for teaching of facts, rules, and action sequences. So when we want learners to come away from a lesson with mostly just the facts, then a direct instruction presentation or lecture format is best suited for the job. Learners do benefit from direct instruction when the objective is the attainment of content knowledge and facts. So as direct instruction provides for teacher to learner construction, it's usually in the form of a lecture-based presentation. Like what I'm doing now can be seen as the direct type of instruction method. We look at indirect instruction in comparison, which is better suited for concept learning, for inquiry learning, and problem-centered learning. So this is actually what we want our learners to be able to do eventually. We want them to be analytical. We want them to be able to review things and come up with their own conclusions. So indirect instruction sets up a learner-to-learner learning process with the teacher acting more as a guide. Thus, this type of instruction helps learners to learn higher order thinking skills, and it gives them the chance to link content knowledge with real-life examples. An inquiry and a discussion-based strategy, as an inquiry and discussion-based strategy, indirect instruction allows for learners to build their own concept and to establish patterns. So as teachers, I can see that we will see that there's a place for both direct and indirect instruction, but we must question ourselves if we do not often put too much focus on direct instruction and neglect also using indirect instruction in the classroom. We move over to Unit 5, which focuses on the support for reading in class, and I want us to consider in the first place the phonic methods of teaching a child to learn. The phonic methods of teaching a child to read. The phonic method is probably the best known and widely used method to teach reading and writing in the English language. It relies on learners being taught the alphabet first and to learn the names of the letters and the sounds they make. Once they know the letters, then they begin to blend the letters together to make simple words, then 3 letters, then 4, and so forth. So to learn via this method, you need phonically written books using regular words that are interesting to young learners. Each word has to be sounded out by the learner to achieve the highest level outcome. For example, you'll have sentences like the cat sat on the mat, the hen is in the pen. Okay, learning the sounds and their blends may be uninteresting for young learners. So that's the disadvantage of this method. So the teacher really has to try and keep it short and entertaining. We also have the problem that a child might be so concentrated on the sound of the words and the blending that he doesn't actually concentrate on the meaning, and that might make the method even more boring. So it is good if the teacher could explain the meaning or expound on the words to keep the child interested and enthusiastic. It's suggested that the teacher introduces one letter a day or one letter a week, although the one letter a day method can work quite well as it does not become so boring. If you do just one letter a week, it might drag out a bit and the learner often loses the plot halfway through, and it might also give a sense of failure and you might feel bogged down by it. But at the same time, just remember, don't be disheartened if you have 2 or 3 days or even a week just to get children to master one letter. We know that each child is individual. Before long, they'll improve, and you'll find there's no stopping their young brains. Children are natural learners, and they're mostly more than willing to please you, thus doing well in their learning experience. If you do choose the phonics method to reading, most children will usually learn to read basic words and sentences within 3 to 6 months. The next aspect I want to concentrate on is what are the symptoms of comprehension problems in reading. And once again, it's also very important to me that you know how to remediate each. So let's have a look at the ones that you should focus on. If a learner has poor vocabulary, you might find that he misses the meaning of the passage, and it can be because the lack of knowledge of word meaning, which can be remedied by working on building vocabulary through the use of a personal word dictionary. A child may read books that are too difficult. What happens then? It takes a very long time to read just a short passage. So this is the rule that you can remedy it with. Give the child the 5-finger rule. If he sees there's more than 5 words per page that he does not know, either how to read it or its meaning, you know it's not the right level book for the child. If the child has problem making visual pictures of material being read, he may read quickly but without intonation because he doesn't understand. So what you can do then is let him practice visualizing what is read. The next problem that may arise is not taking in the information deeply enough. In other words, he reads and then he realizes afterwards that he wasn't concentrating, he was thinking of something else. What you can do there is you can margin monitor with a pencil or a pen so that you can create an interaction between the author and the reader. Then there's also the problem sometimes of not connecting new information with prior knowledge. So the child may show passivity in identifying what he or she already knows about the topic being studied, and he may not be making connections as he or she reads. So what you can do here then is give practice activating the prior knowledge before reading, and then help the learner to organize the new information. We move over to Unit 6. Learning support for writing. I want us to look at an outline of the 6 steps that we should teach our students to write effective essays, because I feel that it's an area that's often neglected, and we find that students at tertiary level still struggle to follow the right steps. First of all, when you get a piece of writing, you need to determine what type of writing it is. What type of essay should you be writing? And in upper primary, you can already expect children to include narrative, expository, argumentative, persuasive, comparative, and literary type of writing, but you need to teach them the features of each. So, once you've determined what type of essay you are writing, you have to create an outline. This is like your roadmap that you're going to follow, and you use it to organize your thoughts about the topic. So obviously you'll write your topic at the top of the page and then start brainstorming. You always need a thesis statement. The thesis statement is the sentence that informs the reader what point you will be making or what question you will be answering about the topic. Then we go over to the introduction. In the first paragraph, you will introduce your topic, and that will provide the direction for the entire essay. You should discuss what the essay is about, then state your thesis and points or arguments that support your thesis. The introduction also sets the tone for the essay, and you want to try and grab the reader's attention with interest and clarity. A way of capturing the reader's attention is to perhaps make a challenging claim about the topic, or maybe presenting them with a surprising piece of information. Then we move over to, in the fifth place, to the body of the essay. The body provides the details for the points in your introductory paragraph that support your thesis. You should take the points now that you've listed in your introduction, and each should be discussed in its own separate paragraph. In every paragraph, the first sentence will be your topic sentence that summarizes your point, and then you will explain why you feel the topic sentence is true. Finally, you must support your argument with evidence such as facts, quotes, examples, and statistics. The last and final step is to present your conclusion. In the conclusion, you should summarize your essay, and you should give the reader closure as well. It should be about 3 to 4 concise sentences which reiterate your thesis and reviews the main points of the body of the essay. Something to be sure of is that you don't restate your points exactly as you did before. You can also briefly add your opinion on the topic, and then please note that it is good if your final sentence upholds your main idea in a clear and compelling manner. Let's look at the importance now of learners monitoring their own writing. We know that even if all steps are followed to produce good quality work, learners can always benefit from monitoring what they are about to hand in. It's usually not enough if the teacher just shows the learner where the errors are. The learner must also know how to correct the errors, so the teacher should demonstrate to the learner how to do this. So in other words, how to check that verbs agree with the subject. For example, don't just make the correction for the child, let the learner learn from his or her own mistakes, because our ultimate goal is for the learner to use English independently, to monitor and correct his or her own language production. That's why in my lessons that I have with students, I prefer to perhaps ask them first, could they identify their own errors? If not, I might underline these, but I will ask the learner first of all to try and correct his or her own error. Okay, you can practice the exercise of free writing with learners. So this is now a totally different topic because it's fantastic to generate ideas for creative writing. So how does it work? It's an activity of writing individual thoughts on paper. Explain to the learners first that when we do free writing, we are simply going to put down every thought we have in our heads. We're going to put it down on paper, so it's a lot like brainstorming. And the goal of the activity is to not stop writing. You'll give them an amount of time, for instance, and say, now you write down all the ideas that you have on this topic. So once they've done that, help the learners understand that although they will begin with a certain topic, it's fine to veer off on tangents as they write, so it's really not that prescriptive. Also say to them they don't have to focus too strongly now on spelling and grammar. Like I said, set a length of time about 2 to 3 minutes. If you've got an older learner, you might take 5 to 10 minutes. So once they've completed the activity, they now go back and they read what they have written, go through all their notes, and then the purpose of this all is to now select all the best ideas that they're going to use in their actual piece of writing. We move over to Unit 6, which deals with learning support for prose. And we are going to distinguish between intensive reading and extensive reading first of all. When we read intensively, it means we need to read for accuracy, and it's done with close guidance of the teacher. It forces the learner to pay more attention to the text, and it also involves profound and detailed understanding. And it's primarily concerned with developing reading strategies. These strategies are judgment, reasoning, interpretation, and appreciation. So intensive reading can be seen as more of an exercise in accuracy. So they do not read a text only for a specific purpose of information. The text is considered suitable for scanning of information, paying attention to the writer's intentions, arguments, ideas, and style as well. They're expected to answer all questions, and this will involve their understanding of text, grammar, and vocabulary. Okay, in contrast, if we talk about extensive reading, now we are concentrating on the learner's fluency, and especially in reading longer texts for pleasure. It's not meant for understanding specific details. It's an activity in fluency, and we let the learner read on his or her own. Sometimes it's also called rapid reading or silent reading. The specific objectives of this type of reading is to understand the meaning as quickly as possible, to increase passive vocabulary, to develop a taste for reading, the habit of reading for pleasure, and to concentrate upon subject matter. Extensive reading means to read silently and quickly, and also without the help of the teacher. It trains the reader to understand the subject matter as quickly and efficiently as possible, and it plays a vital role in the learning of a second or a foreign language. Learners are made to read as much as possible when it comes to extensive reading, but they have the choice and freedom to select a book of their choice. Reading should have its own reward, so there are few or no follow-up activities here. Reading texts are within the linguistic competence of the reader, and they should be allowed to read at their own pace. They choose when to read or where to read. The purpose is that it should create an interest among the learner so that they learn to read faster without any disturbance. Then we come to the benefits of using literature to teach the 5 language skills. How can we do that? Using literature, we can teach children about allusions and different aspects of the English culture. They can learn about context and meaning of famous quotes and phrases, increase their vocabulary, decode expressions that are used for specific purposes. You can produce learners with a fresh and creative angle with which they can approach their studies in particular and their lives in general. Also through literature, learners learn about their own creativity and imagination, interacting with the text themselves, and playing different literary roles. In the 6th place, learners can live literature, not only read it. If they represent plays, the learners can be immersed in a different time and a different person. By reading new words and new phrases, learners' lexicons are increased. Through the reading of literary texts, learners can develop their own autonomy and independence, make hypotheses, and guess unfamiliar words. We also find that the use of authentic literary texts gives learners the opportunity to connect to real-world issues. And in place number 10, through this, learners can learn good moral and social values for their lives. So it has become clear that there's definitely great benefits in using literature to teach learners English. So let's look at the specific benefits that is offered to learners. First of all, economic empowerment, pleasure, language development, acculturation and dissemination of information. It also provides an avenue for the attainment of proficiency in the English language. It provides an avenue for extensive, sustained and interesting reading, writing, listening and speaking, and gives developing readers the opportunity to exercise their skills, strategies and interests. For an independent reader who engages in intensive and extensive reading, literature gives a lot of pleasure. It's also obvious that literature has innumerable benefits that could change the course of our depraved society. For that reason, it's important that we lay an emphasis on the study of literature in both junior and secondary school. It can be used to bring about improvement in listening, speaking, reading and writing of the English language, and in such a way it empowers people. Even those who are science-oriented should study literature in order to improve their language skills, because as we know, science is written in English language and not science. We come now to Unit 8, which is our learning support in issues about poetry specifically. First of all, let's consider the aims of upper primary poetry. In the first place, we want our children or our students to be aware of language. In this sense, they need to know, it is known to increase learners' literacy and linguistic awareness, according to Dr. Janet Hughes. Also, it can help learners to expand their oral and written vocabularies. It also helps learners to become more aware of the ways in which language can be used and the rhythms, images, and meanings that can be created. In the second place, learners develop critical analysis. According to a study done in 2002, learners who study poetry are able to increase their skills of critical analysis. The reason for that is because poems use a variety of techniques. For example, metaphor, imagery, rhyme, and meter to convey meaning. So when students pick out these techniques and thinking about how they function in the poem, it helps them to develop their analytic and critical skills. We also know that poems have multiple layers of meaning that readers must analyze carefully to understand. In the third place, it's very good for creativity and enthusiasm. Learners can become more enthusiastic about poetry in the classroom, connecting their reading experiences to the experiences of music and their own lives. It allows learners to write poetry for class and encourages them to express themselves creatively. Although some learners may not be motivated by writing academic papers, poetry allows them to play freely with words, rhythms, and ideas. And then they refer to the example of Lewis Carroll's poem, The Jabberwocky, which is a very good example of how one can play creatively with rhythm, sound, and language. Okay, let's outline now the 5 ways in which learners may benefit from specifically studying poetry. What they say is that in the first place, poetry may help us to get to know each other as well as build our community. How is that possible? It allows learners to paint sketches of their lives using metaphors and imagery and symbolic language to describe experiences and parts of themselves which they are not ready to share. It allows them to put language to use to make it serve a deep internal purpose, and in the same time they are allowed to break the rules of grammar, punctuation, and capitalization. It also allows the learner to find a voice, representation, and even community. The second reason why we study poetry is when we read it aloud, we can hear that poetry has a rhythm, music, sounds, and beats. Young learners may not understand all the words or the meanings, but they will feel the rhythm, and that might get them curious about what the sounds mean, and also maybe they will be inspired to create their own. Contrary to popular belief, boys really also get into poetry, especially when it's brought in through the rhythm and rhyme. Poetry is one of the most kinesthetic types of all literature because it is physical and full-bodied, and it activates the heart and the soul. It even sometimes bypasses the traps of our minds, and the outcome is that poetry moves us. Reason number 4 is that poetry can open venues for speaking and listening, which is much neglected in the English language art curriculum. For example, spoken word and poetry slams. If we share it in this way, poetry brings an audience, an authentic audience, which will motivate even the most reluctant writer. The 4th reason is that poetry has space for English language learners. Poems defy rules. Poetry can be made accessible, thus, for all English language learners. Poems can easily be scaffolded, and learners can find ways of expressing their voices while even being limited in their vocabulary. Then, of course, poetry is universal. English language learners can learn about or read poetry in their primary language, helping them bridge their worlds. The last reason is that poetry may build resilience in learners and adults as it fosters social and emotional learning. A well-crafted phrase or two in a poem can help us see an experience in an entirely new way. We can gain insight that has evaded us many times, that gives us new understanding and strengths. We move over to our final unit here, learning support in the assessment of English. Now we look at different types of assessment in education, and the first one I'm going to concentrate on here is continuous assessment. It's very important that you plan this type of assessment and schedule it at the beginning of the year, and that it's kept as simple as possible. There are different things you can award marks for, like activities in class, assignments, homework, and short tests on the completion of a topic, and all of these should then be recorded for continuous assessment. Grades that are obtained by the learners must be recorded systematically throughout the year and then used to inform the learners as well as their parents about their progress and achievements. And of course, it's also used to initiate compensatory teaching when it is needed. The second type of assessment is integrative assessment, which is designed to help learners to discover and understand connections between the knowledge, skills, and graduate attributes that they learn through our different lessons. This type of assessment focuses on optimizing the balance between formative and summative assessments, and it can be blended. An effective blend of assignments and assessments is the key aspect of an integrative approach to assessment. Also noteworthy is that in this approach, the many and various strands of assessment come together in a coherent way to address the desired goals. Now, why is assessment important? Why do we focus on it in this unit? We know that assessment just for the sake of assessment will not really make a big difference in our lives, that of teachers or learners. So we need to look at it as a feedback that is crucial for helping people learn. Okay, so what is the good characteristics of an assessment that is meaningful? It should mirror good instruction, it should happen continuously as part of instruction, and it should provide information about the levels of understanding that the learners are reaching. In order for the learner to gain insight into their learning and their understanding, there should be frequent feedback. One of the most important roles for assessment is that learners need to monitor their learning and actively evaluate their strategies and their current levels of understanding. Individuals acquire a skill much more rapidly if they receive feedback about the correctness of what they have done. Provision of timely and informative feedback to learners during instruction and learning so that their practice of a skill and its subsequent acquisition will be effective and efficient is very important. Assessment is needed also for effective teaching, so it's not just to help the learner look and evaluate his own learning. So there are two important conclusions about teachers who are good at assessment. The best teachers will ask themselves, how do I prepare to teach? They begin with questions about learner learning objectives rather than about what the teacher will do. In the second place, they ask themselves, how do I check my learners' progress and how do I evaluate their efforts? They have a systematic program to assess their own efforts and to make appropriate changes. They assess their learners based on the primary learning objectives rather than on arbitrary standards. So we can see that the teacher does not only consider the learner and how he learns, but also the role that he actively plays in the learner's learning. Okay, we learn most effectively in ways that make a sustained, substantial and positive influence on the way that we think. When we try to solve problems or create something new, we should be able to find that is intriguing, beautiful and important. If learners are able to do so in a challenging yet supportive environment in which they can feel a sense of control over their own education, it will be much more meaningful. They should also be able to work collaboratively with other learners to grapple with the problems, and they should believe that their work will be considered fairly and honestly. They should know that they can try, fail, and receive feedback from expert learners in advance or separately. I would like us to have a look quickly at another type of assessment named diagnostic assessment and what it is used for. We focus on diagnostic assessment in order to understand a current situation, to get knowledge about how to improve that situation, and then see which sources are required. Once we have that, we can take action, and this leads to improved learning outcomes. So if you look at diagnostic assessment, then it's specifically aimed at empowering the teacher to focus on what he or she can do to help learners to improve their learning. Okay. That part of assessment was then the last part of this specific unit. So when I go over now to this last slide, I want you just to look at it and consider it for not only the exam but also the assignment that you are still going to answer, and help it in your preparation for your written exams next year. Okay, so my best advice to you will be that if you study, you must understand what you are learning. If you are challenged with many unfamiliar words, have your dictionary handy, look up those words, or look at to find words with a similar meaning. Simplify the work for yourself. When you are challenged with a question in the assignment or in the exams, make sure that you determine what you should actually include in the answer and how you should approach the answer. If you are asked to discuss something, to comment on something, to evaluate or to analyze, you have to write full grammatically correct sentences. You can't be asked an essay question and then you respond only with giving keywords, phrases or bullet points. That's not the correct way to approach such an answer. If it's a level 2 and 3 question, it means that it requires your own input in addition to stating the facts that you've memorized. So in other words, if you are asked to either analyze, examine or evaluate, I expect of you to give me your opinion, to make a judgment and to draw a conclusion. Okay, then the action verbs are also important. The action verbs that I spoke about now refers to the words like analyze, examine, evaluate, comment, all of those. You need to take note on what each of them require. So please see section 7 in the beginning of the study guide to familiarize yourself with those. Then I want to leave you now with my contact details. I'm Ms. Isabel Bes Eng41. You can call me on 081 251 or 2987. If I'm not able to answer my phone, it is best to send me an SMS. Just SMS English41 and I will phone you back at an appropriate time. I must say that I most prefer that you send me an email if you have any query, because that allows me enough time to respond to you in the most appropriate way. Students, I wish you best of luck with this quite challenging and demanding module that you have enrolled for, but I've full belief that you will be successful. Thank you.